Hello, my name is Chuck Mann. I'm going to do an overview of my research paper that I did for critical issues in education. It's called Special Education Placement and the Law. Just a quick synopsis of my research. Special education placement has been dictated by legislation over the past 40 years. Although the legislation has guaranteed opportunities for all students, disabled and non-disabled, the vagueness of the language in the law continues to challenge in identifying a consistent process for placement. Educators, parents, and advocates continue to debate the specific process and what it entails for identifying appropriate education for all students. What is special education? Special education is a process in which a child is identified as someone who has disabilities or special needs, otherwise known as exceptionalities. A few key points to talk about with special education. There is no set point in the development of a child that identifies identification of exceptionality occurs. Disabilities are not discriminatory to gender or race, and special education placement is to ensure that identified students are receiving instruction in regular classroom setting as much as possible. Some key terms that we'll discuss briefly is the least restrictive environment, local education authority, inclusion, mainstreaming, specific learning disability, disabled, non-disabled, individual education program. What is the least restrictive environment? Probably the biggest challenge of special education is to have a consistent description or definition of a least restrictive environment. I found that throughout my research that continues to be the debate. But basically it's a combination of services, settings, personnel, and instruction designed to meet the individual needs of the student. How does the least restrictive environment in special education placement go to get hand in hand? Well, the least restrictive environment means the child is provided special education and related services with peers who are not disabled to maximize extent or appropriate. Placement refers to an educational environment for the provisions of service such as a classroom or school setting, and that continues to be debated over and over. I want to go through a brief history of special education law in the United States, so I thought I'd start with the quote that I put in my paper from one of the sources references I used. Prior to congressional legislation in the 1970s, there were more than 8 million children with disabilities, most of whom were excluded from any educational opportunities. Of those children with disabilities who were educated, almost 70% were taught in separate classrooms or buildings apart from the non-disabled students. Very similar to what the education environment I grew up into in the mid to late 1970s and all the way into the 1980s. Quickly, I'd like to go over some significant dates of special education law. Congress went back as far as 1864 when they created the first school for the deaf. 1878, they established a praying house for the blind. Special education was specifically identified in the provisions of the Social Security Act in 1935. The Community Health Act of 1963 provided funds to construct buildings that would serve individuals who had mental retardation. And in 1965, Congress passed Public Law 8990, known as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. ESEA, as it was referred to, was designed to give opportunities to disadvantaged youth. Amendments later came in 1965 and again in 66 and 68 to provide greater educational opportunities for children with disabilities. Education for all handicapped children, the EAHCA, also known as Public Law 94-142, was passed in 1975. The Education for All Handicapped Children identified requirements for education students with disabilities. These requirements included individualized education in the least restrictive environment based on a child's distinctive needs, provided without cost, and conducted in accordance with definite or a definitive procedure, so it kind of really set the ball rolling of what we have in place today. Finally, in 1990, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, or IDEA, was enacted by Congress, followed by, and that was amended a couple times in 1997, and most recently in 2004, which is called the IDEA of 2004. But most of the things that relates to special education and education in general is ties to No Child Left Behind, which was signed into law by President Bush in 2001, which we are fully aware of in public education. Important court cases. There are several court cases that took place throughout the recent history of the United States in relationship to special education, but there are three I'd briefly like to talk about. The first one was in Pennsylvania, Association for Retarded Children, or PARC, versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In the PARC decision, the court mandated that children with mental retardation were entitled to a free and public education up to the age of 21. The PARC ruling led to the other passing of major legislation. The Mills ruling in Mills versus Boards of Education set the precedent that the lack of funding was not a sufficient reason to deny educational services to children with disabilities. And finally, in 1982, Rowley, or the Board of Education versus Rowley, in the Rowley decision, the court ruled that the state had to provide a guiding definition for a free and appropriate education. It also created a two-part test known as the Rowley test that provides guidance for future court cases that involved educational provisions for children with disabilities. What is IDEA? This is what rules us today in special education. It is the primary federal program that authorizes state and local aid for special education and related services for children with disabilities. IDEA mandates that all children aged 3 to 21 who are identified in one of the more of the 13 categories are eligible for special education placement and related services. I didn't realize, but there are 13 separate categories that are identified by IDEA. They include autism, blindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, mental retardation, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impaired, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairment. And if you're in public education and you work with special ed students or you're involved in an IEP, you'll find out that each student is identified in one or more of these 13 areas. And it continues to be a challenge working with these kids, because with 13 different identifiers, there are only one set of rules specifically identified to accommodate these people in consideration with the least restrictive environment. You know, as I conclude my overview of special education placement law, I just want to go over a few problems that I was able, in my opinion, able to identify. Number one, it's not a problem, but legislation is in place to support special education, but the interpretation of the law has constantly been disputed. There's no true definition of a least restrictive environment. Each student's needs are different, so each IEP is different. An IEP is an individual education program. We deal with those so much in our public schools now. It's almost like we're going down the road of all students being on an IEP in one form or another. And the debate continues over whether all identified students need to be in the regular classroom as part of inclusion. Where do we go from here? You know, through my research, it's obvious that the courts, Congress have mandated that we continue to meet the needs of all students who are identified by following the IEP accommodation. It's the law. We have to follow it. We need to work to meet all the challenges and expectations outlined in No Child Left Behind for children. One thing that we'll continue to battle is finding true definitions of some of the terms or language in special education placement. Least restrictive environment, inclusion, IEP, accommodations. You know, we're challenged with them every day. There are several things that we have to take into consideration. One of the things I came away with is a greater appreciation for special education process, a greater appreciation for all the kids who are identified. But one thing that educators in public and in private or parochial schools have to know, that the law is on the side of the students, our families, with students with exceptionalities. And what I think we're going to gear or go to in the future is not necessarily an IEP as it is for special education for all students, but at some point each student that comes in the classroom is going to have an outlined plan for success. And that's what we're here for, is to educate all students. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you listening to my presentation. I hope I gave you a little bit of information that gave you a better understanding of special education. It's a quick overview, and just as it's continually battled in the courts, it'll continually be researched over and over and over. That's special education placement and the law as requirements for the completion of my AAP 8373 Critical Issues in Education class. Thank you. Appreciate your time.